Good afternoon. I'd like to call to order the March 1st, 2012 Board of Adjustment meeting. Before we begin, I would like to welcome new board member Mike Voorhees. We're glad that you're with us and we welcome you, and to acknowledge the service to our community and to this board of Rod Baker, who has recently retired, and to remind you at this time to turn off your cell phones if you have not done so already. Because Mr. Allen is not in attendance today, I would entertain a motion to strike the minutes of the February 16th, 2012 meeting, and they will be added to the agenda of the next meeting.
So moved. Second.
I have a motion and a second. Register your vote. Approved. Do we have any staff requests for continuance or appeals?
We have two today. Item number 6, case number 13524, is asking for a continuance to March 15th. And item number 7, case number 13525, is asking to be withdrawn.
We'll entertain those separately. I would entertain a motion then on case 13524 to be continued to March 15th. Are there any objections from the public or anybody here to speak to that case? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second. Register your vote. And the next item is case number 13525. The applicant has requested that the case be withdrawn. Would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Register your vote. Didn't hurt. Okay. Would you read the first case, please?
Item number 1, case number 13519, request of Oklahoma City Public Schools for a variance to the maximum sign height located at 1215 Northwest 95th Street.
Please come forward and give us your name and address for the record.
Troy Downing, 14918 Hertz Coral Springs Parkway, with RBA Architects, representing the school district in this matter.
Speak to your application.
Brief history of this is we had a existing sign on the front of Burton Elementary School. It was an 8-foot pylon sign, about 20 square foot of a reader board. What we did with the remodel of the school, we basically doubled the sizes of the school and took down the existing sign, reader board sign that was there, to refurbish and put in a bus lane in that location where it was located. When we put a new entry on the school, we added some sign above the entry reading Burton Elementary School. At that point in time, it was determined that due to the R1 in the neighborhood that 2 signs could not be located on that same face. What we did from there was, under direction, was move the sign to the corner of the lot. After we did that, there was some discussion that that sign then was over the 4-foot allotted height allowance. And what we're asking for today is to reuse that existing refurbished sign on the corner of that lot so the school can have a reader board sign on their property.
In your staff report, it's under unfavorable conditions or considerations. It says the applicant has neglected to address the statutory standards. Do you have a copy of the staff report with you today?
I do.
If you wouldn't mind, just address those real quickly.
Well, the unnecessarily hardship that we'd be, I'm assuming I'm reading off the right one, the hardship that we'd be looking at. First of all, we have an existing sign that has been refurbished for the school. They would like to use that existing sign that they have. The other hardship we feel on that corner would be we have a playground on that corner, and we have fenced area completely surrounding the site. We think it would be a hardship due to the existing fence location and the sight lines on that site to put a lower sign that we feel would be destroyed by the kids in that playground area. We just don't think it would work in that situation. That's why we're asking for the higher sign that would allow us to do that. And I do not believe it would be a detriment or any sightline issues to the public.
Is there any known opposition to this that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
I'd make a motion to approve.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Register your vote. You are approved.
Thank you.
Item number 2, case number 13520, request of Oklahoma City Urban Renewal Authority for a variance to the maximum height limit located at 1325 North Walker Avenue.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Leslie Batchelor and Dennis Box, and we're here on behalf of not only the property owner, the Urban Renewal Authority, but also the developer, Gary Brooks, and Paul Lefevre is handing out an exhibit that will show our requested variance. From a historical standpoint, this is a site that has been through approval by the board for the Urban Renewal Authority. Subsequent to that, we've gone to the Downtown Design Review, which at one point I offered an option about taking this 3-foot 8-inch parapet down, which is on the north west corner. And the Downtown Design Review said no, they wanted that to stay because it was consistent with the building, the design, and that was important. And so we're here before you to request on the corner that we be able to exceed our height limitations by 3 feet 8 inches. We think from a statutory standpoint we meet the conditions. This is a very unusual and peculiar site. It's not very often that you see Mrs. Batchelor and myself appearing before you in regard to a site that has sat vacant for a number of years. Used to be the old Mercy Hospital. It has a grade differential of about 12 feet, and so in order to line it up and make sure that the building looks correct, we think the variance is appropriate. We're here to answer any questions, and don't know if there's any protest that was signed up. There was protest at the Downtown Design Review, although they unanimously recommended approval.
I'm not aware of any protesters from the public to speak to this case. Discussion by other board members, questions?
And I just presume that the material would be consistent with the material throughout the building.
Yeah, the material has been not only reviewed by the architectural group that my client has hired, but also the Urban Renewal Authority has a independent architectural group that has reviewed it, approved it, and it will be consistent with what was submitted to Downtown Design Review.
Well, in that instance, I'd like to make a motion to approve the application.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Register your vote. You are approved.
Thank you very much.
Item number 3, case number 13521, request of Michael Pate for a variance to the maximum 8-foot fence height requirement located at 900 South MacArthur Boulevard.
Mr. Chairman, Board, Mr. Voorhees, welcome.
Hey, if you don't mind, your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Michael Pate, Columbia, South Carolina, for Century Security Systems representing the trucking firm here. We're basically asking for an extension from 8 feet up to 10, as we are the electric security fence, pulsed, battery-powered electric security fence that sits inside the fence line, about a foot. We need to have that extra 2 feet to make sure someone doesn't stand on top of the existing perimeter fence and give it a little hop, so we want to make it a little bit harder for them to do that and also try to drive any perpetrator there down to the bottom of the fence line. We ask your indulgence. Please grant us the request.
I would remind other board members, too, that we've heard requests like this recently, actually, and one of the questions is, you know, the appearance of, and does it create an appearance, and you might explain for the newer board members how that sets back and how it appears from the street.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The electric security fence is 20 strands of wire, horizontal to the ground, 4 inches apart till about 4 feet. After that, we go 8. It's a monitored and alarmed system. So basically, we're using a battery to charge a charger. The battery is powered by a solar panel. We're never hooked into the grid. We work on a pulse system. So we basically load the charger up, and once every 1.2 to 1.3 seconds, we release a pulse down the line and basically do a check of the perimeter. We're monitoring the return voltage. If that return voltage drops below the determined voltage for 4 pulses or about 5.2 seconds, we know there's been a penetration of the perimeter. At that time, we're going to set off the audible alarm, as well as my silent alarm will also go off back to us in Columbia, South Carolina, and we'll go through a call list then. We're trying to avoid any false alarms. We'll go through a call list directly to the manager of that site to actually check that fence line and make sure there's been no penetration out there.
And the staff report says that if your variance request is approved, that you should provide access for emergency vehicles, allow for emergency responders to shut down the power, and also references the signage that would be required.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. That's standard operating procedure for us here in the city now. We actually put a Knox box at the gate for emergency personnel with the prescribed key for the emergency personnel in Oklahoma City. We're also required to have the signs on the fence every 60 feet. The signs basically say, electric security fence, do not touch. They're in English and Spanish on both sides of the sign, and we alternate them as we go down the line.
I'd make a motion to approve with the conditional provision that the emergency vehicle provision and the warning sign provision is a part of the motion.
So a motion and a second. Register your vote. You are approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item number 4, case number 13522, request of Red Rock Behavioral Health Services for a variance to the front yard setback requirements located at 4400 North Lincoln Boulevard.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Terry Pollock. My office is at 11032 Quail Creek Drive in Oklahoma City. I represent the Red Rock Behavioral Health people. Mr. Prawley, the financial officer, is here with us today as well. This project, the project where we're looking to put the flagpole in is their corporate headquarters. They're on 4400 North Lincoln. And the hardship is that the setback, platted setback there of 25 foot, does not allow for any construction within that setback. And since a flagpole is considered a building permit, we would have to get a variance to put a flagpole in this setback. The area, the land, as you can see from the sketch, it's taken up with a lot of different things, and it's been challenging to find any place to put the flagpole. So the clients wanted it, they really wanted it closer out there toward the right way, but it wouldn't fit there. And that sign that is there now is about a 5-foot-high Red Rock sign, is their main sign. So by putting the flagpole behind that like that, it won't block that sign. It shouldn't block any of the sight distance along the south or northbound Lincoln Avenue. So we really feel that as long as we are careful and pay attention to the water line that's underneath it, the flagpole can sit there nicely.
You aware of any opposition?
We have not heard of any opposition, and the report, the staff report was, the comment was no unfavorable considerations have been identified in their staff report.
I'd make a motion to approve the application.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Register your vote.
Thank you very much.
Item number 5, case number 13523, request of Chesapeake Land Company for a variance to the hard surface paving requirement located at 11935 South I-44 Service Road.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just need to disclose that, in my job that I have, done work and will likely have future dealings with Chesapeake Energy, which I believe is the parent. I don't believe that there to be any conflict or my inability to evaluate this request impartially, but did want to disclose, and if there's any objection, then I will recuse.
We have no objection.
Any objection from other board members? Thank you for
No
disclosing.
objection.
Mr. Chairman, if you all will recall, this used to be a business called Tower Tech, and the city was involved, and it ended up going out of business, and Chesapeake ended up acquiring this. This is going to be used for a building and parking areas that will take very, very heavy equipment, and therefore the trucks will be multi-axle trucks, very heavy. Some of that equipment will be placed on the area that's gravel. There's a couple of buildings they'll be working on. There's an office building. When Chesapeake ended up acquiring this, there was also already a portion of the property that was gravel parking. we need to expand that, and the reason we need to expand it is because the area in question will be utilized primarily for storage of the heavy equipment, the trucks driving over it, and does not lend itself to the kind of pavement that would be torn up in a short period of time. There are similar businesses, and the exhibit that Mr. Johnson handed out shows some of those businesses in close proximity. Those businesses have gravel parking areas and gravel storage areas, and so what we're asking for is not dissimilar to what you find in the area. So as we look at this, it's a unique situation in that we do have parking that is paved and will continue to have paved parking, but the areas that we want to have the heavy trucks and the heavy equipment, we'd like to have the opportunity to have gravel that would be consistent with what you'd find in the surrounding businesses.
I'd like to ask if there's anybody from the public that wishes to speak on this case, either for or against. Hearing none. Board members, do you have questions?
Make a motion to approve.
Second. Motion and a second. Register your vote. You are approved.
Thank you very much.
Item number 8, case number 13514, appeal of Douglas and Sandy Beal of the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission regarding the denial of a certificate of appropriateness for the replacement of a tile roof located at 610 Northwest 14th Street.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Dennis Box and David Box, and we're here. Dr. Beal and his wife are here. Sam Gresham is here. I know there's a couple of neighbors that are here in support, and I think there's probably a couple of people that live within the area that are here in protest.
And if I could, before we begin, I would like, on this case in particular, because this is an appeal of an HP denial of a CA, is to set the boundaries for the matters with, you know, what this board can consider, and what I'd like for you to observe too as boundaries of what our discussions and considerations are today.
Yes, sir.
I guess, you know, we treat this as a new case. The question is did HP follow properly the guidelines, and is the roof appropriate? I'd like to just read real quickly. The appeal shall be limited to the issues and evidence presented to and decided by the Commission and the grounds specified in the Notice of Appeal. In deciding an appeal, the Board shall use the same standards and criteria of review as set forth in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. This Board may affirm, reverse, or modify the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission. If there is new evidence that you wish to present, at that point, this Board would make a decision about whether to remand that back to HP for further action on their part.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you've very succinctly provided what we plan on presenting today, and that is the guidelines, and David Box is going to go through the guidelines that you are to consider and why we believe we met those guidelines. We were not involved in this process before the HP Commission, but if you look at the guidelines, and I think probably one of the most telling tales of this case is the fact that the architect for the HP Commission wrote a staff report reviewing the guidelines in detail, recommending approval.
But I would remind you that we're not bound, and neither was HP, by a staff recommendation. I mean, it is a recommendation, and it's nothing more. And you know, although we honor their opinion, we are, again, not bound by that.
I understand that. I agree with you, but it is, I think, something important to consider when you have an architect, an HP architect, that knows the guidelines, reviews the guidelines, and recommends approval. What we're going to do is show you that she was correct, and that is through the facts that the HP Commission didn't consider, and therefore we think that the decision should be overturned, and we should be able to leave the roof on that exists. Now, Dr. Beal and his wife have completed the roof. It is on when he is here. When you all ask him questions, if you have any questions to ask, we have the tile existing, and we will have that available to see. But I think it's important, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, there are a set of guidelines that are incorporated within your ordinances, and when we look at those in detail, we think we comply with them. Number two, is it reasonable? Well, this roof cost $125,000, and a shade of color, in our opinion, should not necessitate the removal of a roof, especially when you find out the options that we had when the roof was put up. I talked to a neighbor right across the street by the name of Dick Tannenbaum, who couldn't be here today but wanted me to make sure you all understood that, in his opinion, that was one of the nicest amenities that could have been placed on that home, and he's lived there across the street for 10 years. So with that said, do we think that we follow the guidelines? Absolutely. Do we think the roof is reasonable? Absolutely. And I'm going to let David talk about the guidelines themselves and why we meet it. We're going to have Sam Gresham, who is an architect, deals with historical preservation issues, and has knowledge about what has taken place with regard to this roof, which was put on in about 1908, and can tell you the modifications that have been made over the years and why he thinks it's appropriate. Thank you. David.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, David Box, 522 Colcord Drive. I have handed out a black binder. I want to make sure everybody has, because this is what we believe lays out the standards and was the evidence that was presented to the HP Commission, and will show why the decision of the HP Commission was incorrect. Does everybody have their binder? And it's the same information that you have, it's tabbed so we can move through it quicker. I think to start, I would like to read the motion to deny that was made by the HP Commission, because I believe it lays out why their decision was incorrect and not based on the guidelines that they are charged to follow. So tab A is the motion. Commissioner Massey made the motion, and I quote, "As we were reminded by Ms. Givens that we are looking at the tiles as if this was a brand new application, and I just don't think that I am in agreement that this was the correct roof, and I am prepared to move to deny HPCA 11-00132 with prejudice, listing all the standard findings of fact for denial." He was interrupted by Commissioner Roland Tague, who, and I quote, "I think we need to have some specific findings since the staff recommended approval, and you set them out there in your introductory portion. It seems to me you want to reiterate the finding as to color, the form of tile," end quote. Mr. Massey then took that and stated, "Texture, darker red clay, tile is smooth without any texture to break up the glaze, etc." And this is the most important part. From this Randy Floyd letter. So, as you can see, the motion for the denial wasn't based on the standards. It was based on a letter submitted by a protester. So with that in mind, I think it's important that we turn to what the standards were. Those standards were laid out in the staff report, which will be Exhibit E. Now, this is the recommendation page of the staff report that was given to the HP Commission. What I would like to do is go through the 6 specific findings of fact that staff provided to the HP Commission. The first one, that the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation on which the preservation guidelines and standards are based take into consideration economic and technical feasibility for their application. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, this takes it out of the normal board case. Our normal board cases, we can't consider economic hardships as part of granting a variance, but here, economic feasibility and technical feasibility are a crucial standard to apply. So when we look at the economic feasibility of what we have in this case, as Dennis pointed out, the roof that is up cost $125,000. Now, when Dr. Beal and his wife purchased the home, the purchase price was $425,000. So the $125,000 roof represents a 29% value of the home. Now, the roof that was originally on there was a custom run back in 1908. That specific color doesn't exist. To match it as close as possible would be a custom run at a cost of $275,000. That is 65% of the value of the entire home. So when we look at economic feasibility, I believe the roof that was installed is the appropriate roof. Now, technical feasibility. Part of the process was the Beals talked to a representative from the Ludovici, which is the tile company that makes the tiles. And he submitted a letter, which can be found as Exhibit F, which is an email from him to Sam Gresham. And in this email, he outlines the fact that they don't make this color anymore. They never did. It was a custom run back in 1908. So even if they wanted to match the exact color, it would not be possible. So this goes into our technical feasibility argument. It's not technically feasible. They couldn't match this color exactly if they wanted to. Something else, this was put in 1908. With 103 years of harsh Oklahoma weather, how do we know what the exact color was in 1908? I would argue that the color over time has faded. The second specific finding of fact, that the existing roof was not completely original and was modified about 20 years ago, which may explain some of the color differences in the existing tile. Now for that, I have 3 tiles that I'd like to show you. In 1987, much of the roof had been destroyed, and somebody came in and replaced a significant portion. This is Exhibit C, and this represents what was replaced when the original roof, which is Exhibit B, was damaged. So in 1987, that color was put on, which meant the original historic roof had lost much of its historic fabric. And as you can see from our picture here, the top is the after. The bottom is the before. I would submit to you that there is not any difference in the before and after, except for now we have a roof that functions and is uniform. Specific finding of fact number 3, that the roof sustained significant damage in storms over the past 18 months. That's what brought about this new roof. Over the last 18 months, as everyone knows, we've had big hailstorms. Everyone has had roof problems. I know I've had mine. So what they had to do was to get a new roof. And that's what they did. They talked to the tile company, and that's when they found out that the original roof, which wasn't even original anymore because it had been changed in 87, wasn't able to find. So they had to go with the closest match they could. And that's what you see here on the far left, which is Exhibit D. Now, specific finding of fact number 4, that the proposed roof is similar in material, size, shape, finish, and pattern to the existing roof. Now, this is significant. At the hearing, the architect for the HP staff noted that the new roof is similar in material. It's still a clay tile roof. It's similar in size. As you can see, it's still a barrel-shaped roof. It's similar in texture. It's still a glazed roof. And it's similar in color. Now, it is slightly darker, but as I mentioned earlier, you have a roof with 103 years of weathering. You're going to have a change in color over that time. But as we also mentioned, The exact color doesn't exist. You can't get it even if they wanted to. Even if they wanted to, the closest they could get is still going to be different, and it would cost $275,000.
Mr. Box, if I can,
Yes, sir.
could you pass those around? I'd like to see the 1987 and I guess 2011 or 2010, whatever you're about. Thank you.
I'll let that pass around while.
And just for clarification, David,
Yes, sir.
Exhibit D is what is presently installed on the house?
Yes, sir. And the other one you have is what was put on in '87 to fill in the gaps of the 1908 roof that had been damaged and lost.
Do we have a representation of the original tile?
Yes, sir.
Please proceed.
Specific finding of fact number 5, that the difference in color between the proposed roof and the original roof, while not exactly the same, is acceptable in consideration of the options available for use. This is the critical point, because based on the guidelines which the HP Commission was to follow, the shade of green was different but acceptable. It met those guidelines. Number 6, that this action is consistent with the provisions of subchapters 2.1, 2.7, and 2.10 of the Preservation Guidelines and Standards. Now, one key point in this is that we follow the standards for rehabilitation and not restoration. So what that means is, if we followed restoration, you would have to do everything in your power to match it exactly, no matter cost. But because we follow the guidelines for rehabilitation, we are allowed to use our economic feasibility. Now, I would like to go through the subchapters.
Could you expound on that and why you were bound by one and not by the other?
I'm sorry?
Why you were bound by one and not the other?
The municipal code adopts the guidelines for rehabilitation and not
And
restoration.
define rehabilitation.
I would have to defer to Catherine Montgomery on that for the exact definition of rehabilitation. So turning to Exhibit H, which is subchapter 2.1, it states that repairs shall be done with like materials. And as we've discussed, we have like materials. It's still a clay roof, it's still a glazed roof, and it's still the same barrel shape. Subchapter 2.7, which is going to be Exhibit I. This tells us that new roofing materials matching the original, existing, or previously used roofing materials in appearance, style, material, and composition may be installed. So this matches all of our previous arguments. We have the same style. We have the same material. We have the same glazing. Exhibit J, which is subchapter 2.10, this gets into when replacement is necessary, what you need to follow. And it states, if replacement is necessary, new materials must match historic materials in composition, size, shape, color, pattern, and texture. Consider substitute materials only if original materials are not available or technically feasible. And as we've outlined, they're not available, and they're certainly not technically feasible based on the exhibit from the Ludovici rep to Sam Gresham. So, finally, Exhibit K. This is important because this is a staff report from an HP application back in 1995. And why this is significant is because this shows, if you'll turn to the last page of Exhibit K, and this is just from 1980 to 1994, you have 4 separate cases in which somebody had to replace a roof. But in these cases, they didn't even replace a roof with the same material. They actually changed material. They went from tile to composition, was approved. They went from tin to composition, it was approved. They went from asbestos to slate, it was approved. They went from wood shingle to asphalt. So what we're asking for is not out of the ordinary. In fact, it is less damaging than all of these other previous cases that were approved. And finally, Exhibit L. As Dennis mentioned, Mr. Tannenbaum is in support, and Exhibit L is a list, or letters from other people in the area submitting their support for this application. Because, in their opinion, it's an improvement. The roof looks better. But more importantly, it meets all of the standards that the HP Commission was to follow as outlined in this staff report. The protest focused on the shade of green, and I would submit to this board that the shade of green is not the issue. The issue is, does this roof comply with the standards that the HP Commission was to follow? And we submit that it does, and that's why the staff recommended approval. I'll answer any questions you have.
I tell you what, David, at this time, let's go ahead. There are a couple of other folks that would have asked to speak on this case.
If I may, I would like Sam Gresham to come up and speak as well.
Mr. Gresham.
My name is Sam Gresham, 400 Northwest 23rd. I'm an architect in the city. I have 30 years of experience with the HP Commission, and throughout that time, the first 15 or so, I was a contractor, and I was the one that replaced that roof in 1987. I was hired by then the owner to do the repair with the idea that we could find that tile. I discovered at that time that tile was very expensive. I mean, it was, I remember the owner staggering backwards and holding his hand over his chest when I told him it was $250,000 back then. So we, in an effort to find a solution to repair this roof, I purchased 9 square, about a quarter of that roof, in the tile that's the green Spanish. I don't know the exhibit number, but it's one of the intermediate colored tile in between. It doesn't match the original tiles. It is a different tile, and it was a quarter of the roof. I removed the lower portion of the roof, took all the tile that survived, and moved them up to the top, and then we, of course, replaced some of the top as well. This roof is not visible from any closer distance than 10 feet. The shade of green is the only thing in dispute, it appears, and that difference is very difficult, I think, to get much of a sense of, because you're never at a place where you can see it from any other than a distance. And throughout my experience with HP, the number of applications I brought before boards, in some cases I was the only applicant, and I'd bring 4 or 5 as a contractor when HP was beginning and it was sort of few neighborhoods. In that time, aesthetics played a big role in what decisions were made. I welcomed the institution of the guidelines. I saw that the improvement in clarity sort of came about as, the offset to aesthetics were no longer considered in this case, but it was guidelines. So that helped. That helped a great deal. But it seemed that so much of the applications were influenced by neighbors. It was easy to gain influence through some sort of, in my opinion, subterfuge. I could see decisions being made because commissioners were influenced in ways that didn't really relate to specific issues of historic preservation. It was my observation that was true. However, in this case, I didn't see that historic preservation guidelines were being used at all. When the reference was to a letter that was sent in by a former commissioner and someone protesting the color change, I would suggest that since the roof was 1/4 not original, and a great portion of that roof was in very bad shape, that replacement would have taken 4 or 5 months for delivery, at least at the time that I did it. We were under some time constraints. I assume they were too, because the rain, or the probable rain damage could have been more severe. That the idea that waiting 4 or 5 months would have been very difficult for them, as well as paying $275,000 for an additional full roof that, and in this case, we're talking over $400,000 to tear off what we've done, replace it with a new roof. So I find this a little extreme when we're just talking about the shade of green. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Mr. Gresham, can I ask?
Sure.
That's okay. What percentage of the roof following the recent hail damage would you say that precipitated the replacement?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Was salvageable?
There were quite a few photos that were taken of the damage, and they were in the HP application. I think the owners could probably address that. I don't know. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Doug Beal, 610 Northwest 14th and 1415 North Hudson. It was 100%. It was written down by insurance claim. It was a combination of one of these pieces that are still in the box that we can hand around has on the back of it the dates that the tile was manufactured. It was 1898 to 1903. By the time that the hailstorm, you might remember the one last June that came through, it was a combination of 100 years of wear, and the hailstorm just finished it off. So our insurance company, USA, sent a representative out. He got on the roof using a tall ladder, took photos. We have plenty of photos, and we can show some of those to you. Came down, declared it a 100% loss by the insurance company. The individual least likely to say it's a 100% loss because they have to pay for it. And that's a little bit long, but that's an answer to your question. It was a total loss. And we could pass the tile around if you want to see the date on the back of it.
In your packet, Exhibit G is a series of photos showing the damage to the roof and then also showing what the damage to the roof had done to the interior of the home.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to invite Marva Eller to speak.
Mr. Chairman and members, I'm Marva Ellard, 1521 North Chartel, and
Hold that microphone straight.
better. I'm not that tall, am I? And I'm chairman of the Historic Preservation Review Committee. We were involved in this after it started earlier in the fall. I would like to address a few of Mr. Box and Mr. Gresham's comments, if I may. Dr. Beal did clarify one. This is an insurance claim. So to bring money into the equation, I think, is a bit misleading. I spent most of yesterday talking to Thad Jennings, who owns Genco Roofing, and Peter Hines, who is the Ludowici rep from Dallas. As we all remember, the May hailstorms devastated Nichols Hills, and there are a lot of tile roofs in Nichols Hills. A lot of those roofs sat with blue tarps on them for months while those claims were worked out, and legal help was needed in some, but by the time the claims were resolved, almost all of those were replaced with their original roofing type. We didn't get some of the hail that has been referred to, the June storm. Didn't hail in Heritage Hills. I'm not refuting that that roof was severely damaged. From the pictures, it's obvious that it was. I think it was cumulative, and so I don't know that it's really important. One thing I can tell you about Ludowici, every tile run is a custom run. They don't stock tile like we can go buy a bundle of composition shingles at Home Depot. It doesn't work that way. They make it when it's ordered. They cannot make that exact green because some of those minerals in those glazes have been outlawed because we've determined that they're carcinogenous now and we can't make them. But Ludowici has assured me that they can get between 95 and 97% to that same color. So that to me is a lot closer than the tile that is on the Beals roof now. The one thing in the staff report that stands out to me under roofs, 2.7, historic roof materials shall be retained and preserved. Mr. Hines told me that that particular roof that was on the Beals house was an extremely rare roof. And he said that he felt like it contributed dramatically to the historic significance of that house. To take that roof off and to replace it with a different roof of a different color, to me, has greatly impacted that house. It's not like me changing shingle colors on my house. I don't think we can compare those two things. Reading on, if historic materials are deteriorated beyond repair, then the replacement materials shall match the historic materials in all visual and compositional aspects. Color to me is visual. So color to me is a visual aspect as outlined in the staff report. The number $275,000 to $450,000 to replace that roof has been batted around between the Beals and the Boxes. You have a field report in your packet that was prepared by Ludowici saying that if they did go back with what was called the T12, I believe it's what it's called, that was the original tile on the house, that it would be very expensive. But there is what they call an S-shaped tile, which is for Ludowici a very common tile that is produced all the time, that could have been made in that color, and Mr. Hines guesstimated that that roof could have been replaced with what could have been salvaged plus added to from the S tile by Ludowici for $90,000. So that's drastically different than a $400,000 price tag. The other thing that I would like to, color is a major point of this. Mr. Box said the color is acceptable. I don't think by the staff report and the standards that the color is acceptable. And I think that is one of the main things. But Shinto tile, which is the tile that the Beals have on the house, is not Ludowici tile. So I think you've got apples and oranges here. You can't compare a Ludowici product with a Shinto product. The Ludowici was available and could have been used, but the Beals chose not to. I drive a Volvo. I like Volvos, but I can't tell people I drive a Mercedes because I don't drive a Mercedes. These are the real estate disclosures off of today's multi-list site. In it, the Beals realtor describes it as an Italian tile roof completed in September 2012. And in the real estate disclosures, Dr. Beal describes it as the roof was replaced in April 2011 with green tile imported from Ludowici. It wasn't. I'm happy to give these to Kathy or JJ for your review. This house is a very handsome house. It's very unique to the neighborhood. We would like it to retain its original characteristics.
Thank you for your testimony. Why don't you give that to Kathy and any board members that want to look through it, and we'll return it to you at the end of the meeting. Roland Tague has also requested the opportunity to speak.
Members of the board, my name is Roland Tague. I'm a commissioner for the Historic Preservation Commission. Our chairman recused on this case, so she could not appear and present the commission's view, so they asked me to do so.
And if you would, for the record, please name it. We've got your name and your
Okay,
address.
my address is 100 North Broadway, Suite 3300,
Thank you very
Oklahoma
much.
City.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question before Ms. Tague proceeds? Obviously, as a resident, I think he has every right to appear before this board and give whatever opinion he has. If he's getting ready to give his opinion on what the commission decided, that's part of the record. You all have got the tapes and reviewed them and analyzed the record, and so I think that would be inappropriate. In my mind, it'd be similar to a trial judge deciding that he's going to go up to the Court of Appeals on oral argument and explain why he thought his decision was correct. So I don't know what he's here to testify about, but...
And what I'd like to do at this time is just note your objection for the record and allow him to proceed, and I'm sure, he may be speaking as a citizen of our community and perhaps.
Mr. Box raised this issue once before, sent a letter to the city attorney's office as to whether I could appear when I was chairman. The city attorney wrote an opinion that said, in effect, if the commission wants to hear from a commissioner then and thinks the information they might provide would be helpful, they have a right to decide that. If they don't, that's up to them. So that's what we have gone on ever since that issue was raised. So, the first thing I would like to tell you is that, and I'm sure you understand this, that one of the standards that we have to comply with when we have completed work, in other words, work that's done before a CA is obtained, is that we have to disregard the fact that the work is completed, and we have to treat this just as a new application. So we don't get to or can't penalize someone who has done the work first and then comes in. But on the opposite side, there is no basis for the person. It doesn't make a difference that they're going to have to take it off and start again. That's just the way the city ordinance, not the guidelines, the city ordinance is written. So whenever we have an application such as this one, we judiciously make sure that we don't take into account in making our decision the fact that it's there. Obviously, we have to see what the existing product looks like, but that is what that's about. The next thing I would like to tell you is what we use as a standard for roof replacement. This is standard 2.7, and it says, replacement roofing materials shall match the original, that's one of our options. In other words, what was put on in 1900, whatever, when this house was built, the existing, so that's what was damaged, or previously used roofing materials, or there is a provision that we can allow people to put on weathered wood composition roof, a composition roof. But in making our decision, we have to determine if the roofing materials match in appearance, style, composition, pattern, color, as documented by physical or photographic evidence. Now, our guidelines were passed in 2003, I believe. I came on the commission that same year, and they were brand new. So when someone comes to the commission and says, look, this decision was made in 1990 based upon old guidelines, we don't treat that as precedent, that we have to follow that or that we can follow that. You know, we have people who come and say, I think it's pretty. Well, we don't follow that guideline. There is no such thing. We try to follow as judiciously as we can the standards that are in the guidelines. We don't go to the Secretary of the Interior standards and look at those unless our guidelines don't address the issue. But here with roofs, they're pretty clear. The guidelines address the issue. So when we made our decision, we looked at the roof and we tried to determine if the replacement material matched in appearance, style, composition, and color. Now, council made reference to the staff report, and you have to remember that the staff report was written with a view of approval. And in our staff reports, at the end of the staff report, is a proposed motion, findings, and so forth for the recommendation that the staff makes. If we vote differently or decide to vote differently, then we can't use the findings that our staff has presented to us. We have to make our own findings to comply and find that the roof matches in appearance, composition, and so forth. We did have before us a letter from an architect who opined as to the color, the style of the tile, the sheen, and so forth. And we take into consideration, we're not like a court where we have rules about hearsay and things like that. If we get a letter, we look at it. If we have a witness who says something someone told them, we take that into consideration and in making our decision. So it was not, to me, unusual that we looked at the Randy Floyd letter as a part of it. The roof, according to testimony we heard, had pieces that could be reused. It can be picked up and moved and reused. If you look at the photographs of the color of the old roof, you'll see there's a variance in color. There's a little lighter green and a little darker green, but you won't see that tile on the roof. That is a different manufacturer. That is a different style. We were told that is an S-shaped style, and that the Luigi tile is a barrel-shaped style. If we're going to go back in appearance, that's one thing we looked at in terms of appearance on the roof of the tile that's put back. In terms of the sheen, that roof tile has a greater sheen than the sheen that you see in the photographs that are in your packet. We thought that the sheen of the material was different. And as to color, we didn't believe that the color matched what we saw in the photographs. I didn't go out there. I didn't see the roof firsthand. I relied upon what was presented. We took all of that into consideration, and we believed that, unfortunate as it is for this applicant, that they put on the wrong roof. And we felt like we had no choice but to deny it. I mean, I'll have to agree with my architect friend back here that prior to the passage of the guidelines, I always heard that commission are the taste police. And I came before it, and maybe they chose my taste one time. Who knows? But we do our best not to apply our own taste. We do our best to follow these guidelines, to follow them consistently, and we believe in this case that we did.
There was a reference by David about restoration versus rehabilitation and the standard that was applied.
Well, that is in the national standards. I don't find that anywhere in the guidelines.
Does it affect your consideration or 2.7 and the application of the standard?
Well, let me tell you, for instance, a case we had. We had a case where a man was replacing these huge columns about this big, and this was a house built about the same vintage of the one in question, and it had wood columns, and he came back and he put columns back that looked the same way, but he used a different material. Now that probably isn't, historic, but it is restoration to look the same. But I voted in favor of it, and the other commissioners who voted in favor of it didn't believe that looked the same.
Can I ask you about
Yes.
guidelines? I keep hearing the word guideline, and I'm curious, and I apologize for my ignorance, but are these guidelines mandates, or are these considerations?
Well, let me just give you a little history as I understand it, and our municipal councilor, I'm sure, will straighten me out if I'm wrong, but prior to 2003, they commissioned a group to go through and prepare much more well-defined guidelines as to various restoration. And these were put together in a book, and they're called guidelines. They were not adopted one by one as an ordinance, but there was also a city ordinance called the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And in that ordinance, we have things like replacement materials. That's directly out of the ordinance. The city council then adopted the guidelines by ordinance. And we have always understood that those guidelines are mandatory. And that's why, you know, some of them, I have a thing about garage doors. Well, one guy came through with an echo door, and we were required to have wooden doors. And somebody let it slip, but that doesn't, I mean, to me, the wood door is the wood door.
Okay, and my follow-up to that is we've talked a lot about the need for visual and compositional aspects and the need for these things to match. Well, what do you do in those situations if they don't match?
Well, if somebody comes to us and says, I can't get this thing, this piece of wood or this concrete or whatever it is, because I've scoured the world over and it doesn't exist, then we have to, at that point, look at something that would come close. I mean, you can't leave a window off or a door off, but we have to look at something that would come as close to the appearance, composition, pattern, and so forth. In this case, the first time we heard this case over 3 meetings. I think one of the meetings was brief and was a continuance. But the first case, I understood that there was no tile from Luigi that matched this. At the last meeting, this evidence turned up that there was. So we believe that Luigi makes tile that does match, so we're not in the predicament that we are with occasional things where you just can't.
But the color, though, just to be clear on the Luigi, it would not be the same as the tile from 86?
It probably will not be exact.
Okay.
You know, if you look at the tile that was in the photographs and you look at the darkest tile in the photograph, it's not that color. So and again, this is only my opinion, but if somebody had come in and said, like with my notes, there was some yellow and there was some green, and they wanted to put something in between, I don't know how we deny them, because that color, although it's blended, and if you look at the photographs, you can see there are differences in color, but somewhere in that range of color, I think we have to approve it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tague. I'd like to call Catherine Montgomery,
May I
please.
ask him one more question real quick, Mr. Tague?
Certainly.
And I just want to make sure I'm clear on this point, and I'm sorry, but you referenced Section 2.7 entitled roofs, correct?
Yes.
And you said the commissioners rely on that, correct? And there also is a Section 2.10 entitled materials and finishes. You rely on that too, don't you?
Well,
The commissioners look at that, don't they?
Pardon me?
The commissioners look at 2.10 too, correct?
Mark, let me answer you this way. If we have sections on doors, we used to have a section on doors that was, and I may have my windows and doors different. The doors weren't as well defined as the windows, so when we don't have well-defined guidelines, we move over to that general one.
Sure.
When we have defined guidelines, such as 2.7, we stop there. We don't go beyond that.
But you would agree with me that 2.10 contemplates substitute materials when there are not original materials in existence, correct?
I'd have to look at 2.10.
All right. And you would agree with me that 2.7 contemplates the use of composition materials, correct?
Yes. In fact, we have a city ordinance that says you cannot prohibit somebody from putting a composition roof on their house.
And you would also agree that Section 2.1 contemplates like materials, not identical materials, correct?
Uh-huh.
Right. Thank you very much.
But like materials, that's where we get to the point where you don't have a roof that matches. Then we have to look at like materials, and
Okay.
that's what I don't see here.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
I would like for Catherine to address, first of all, the purpose of the guidelines, and second, differentiate restoration and rehabilitation in the context that David presented it in his testimony.
I can address number 2 easier than number 1 to begin with.
Okay.
The Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic buildings and guidelines for rehabilitating, restoring, preserving, and reconstructing buildings is kind of the industry standard when you're looking at dealing with existing buildings, landscapes, whatever. There are 4 different treatment types, as I just ran through them: restoration, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and preservation. Each one of those different types of treatments have standards connected to them. So the standards for restoration, for example, are used when a resource no longer exists and you choose to rebuild it. Then these standards give you a framework for decision making as to what would be appropriate to reconstruct that significant structure. The standards for preservation actually assume that the property has been occupied continuously and used continuously since the day it was finished, so that really what you're doing is you're just maintaining. The standards for restoration assume that you have focused in on the most significant historical period for a particular resource, and your goal is to restore that resource to look exactly like and be exactly like that historic resource. The standards for rehabilitation, out of those 4 different treatment types, is actually the least restrictive. And it assumes that you may have a property that has been vacant for an extended period of time, may have extended or deferred maintenance types of issues that need to be addressed. So these standards are also the standards that allow what we call contemporary life adjustments, so that, for example, you identify the primary on the interior, which we don't even look at in Historic Preservation Commission. But on the interior, for example, if you have spaces that were always open to the public, maybe in your house it's the living room and it's the entry experience, then you're encouraged to retain as much of the historic fabric as you can for those spaces. And then for the things that are secondary, like the bathroom, maybe the bedroom, those are the places that you focus on making your changes. Maybe the kitchen, because we use those things differently than they did a long time ago. As far as the guidelines are concerned, the preservation guidelines for Oklahoma City are actually guidelines and standards. They include permissive language and they include directive language. So they are there to assist the Historic Preservation Commission with making decisions. And in fact, in the ordinance, there are about, 6 or 7 different things that the Commission can rely on in their decision making. Number 1 is the Preservation Guidelines and Standards, the document that Mr. Teague was talking about that originates from 2003. And then the last item, which is the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. Across the country, the standards for rehabilitation form the foundation for standards and guidelines that local communities use with their historic preservation commissions. Those kinds of things can be coordinated with other offices. In our case, because we're a certified local government and have a relationship with the State Historic Preservation Office, they review all of the guidelines that CLGs have across the state of Oklahoma for their consistency with those basic tenets that are in the standards for rehabilitation.
And I think, maybe the underlying question is, why does this make a difference? And I think, the benefit to a neighborhood and to the homeowners that live within the neighborhood is consistency, continuity, even application of rules that apply to everybody that lives within that district. Any other questions?
I think it bears noting that consistency of decision-making is kind of what is sought, as opposed to with consideration of the unique history associated with each and every site within a historic district. Instead of making the same decision for Joe's house as you make for Betty's house, just because they're in the same district, it's really, well, but if Joe's house is a Queen Anne and Betty's house is a modern movement, the same decisions may not be appropriate for both of those properties.
Any questions for Catherine at this time? If not, thank you very much. I'd like to invite Christy Rieger, if I've pronounced your name correctly.
Hi, I'm Christy Rieger. I live at 609 Northwest 14th Street, directly across the street from the house that we're speaking of. I believe that the tile on the roof that the Beals have put on is like material. We probably more than anybody are impacted by this roof because in the picture, I mean, if you just look due north, in the picture, that's our house, that one. And all three of our living areas, as well as our master bedroom and another bedroom, all look out onto the Beals' house. Their house is 2 stories and ours is 3, so I mean, we look at the roof. And it's gorgeous, and I know that opinions maybe aren't what you're looking for as far as, aesthetics, but it looks so much better than it did. I do know it's light material, as far as the glossiness. The gentleman said that he hadn't been out there to see it. Well, I see it every day. And I don't know if you can tell. You can't really see so much in the photos, but before it was replaced, you could tell the difference. You could tell it wasn't one roof. And so what they have done has really improved it from what you see when you drive by or what you're sitting on my front porch. The glossiness, you cannot tell that there's a difference from the street. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure what Catherine's last name was, but what she's talking about and what you brought up as far as continuity within the neighborhood, that is a huge frustration with people that live in these historic neighborhoods because and I'm not even talking about the difference between a Queen Anne and a Federation type building or design. But the difference is in when one person comes and wants to tear down a carriage house and rebuild it, and another person comes in for the same thing, one person is approved and another one's not. And so it's very confusing to the neighborhood what you can actually do. And when you read it in the guidelines and you try to do what is right, because I'm a huge proponent for preserving our homes the way they should be. But when you read it and it says light material, the same color, size, shape, whatever, and you do all that you can with what is available today, because our houses, we don't live in Edmond. These houses were built at the turn of the last century. So it, to me, is very important that there is some sort of leeway. And yes, it's not the exact hue of green, but it is green. It's the same color. It's just, like the gentleman said earlier, perhaps it is faded. But I will say that I speak for, my family, and I know that I can't speak for neighbors to the board, but in conversations with several of the neighbors that actually live on the block, we're all very much in favor of the roof.
And I appreciate your comments. And I would just say that, as Roland testified, the purpose of the standard is to give you a guideline that, without your personal bias, that you sit back and you apply, an application against that guideline. And that's part of the reason is to provide that continuity and so that it's fair to everybody that's a homeowner in terms of the application of the rules. And much different than when it was perhaps more political and it was, depending on who you knew or, that sort of thing. And so I do appreciate your input as a neighbor directly across the street, and thank you for...
And I appreciate you letting me come and speak because, I know there are other people that are neighbors here that maybe have, that one that spoke against it, and, and she's a friend as well. And so, it's not comfortable to, speak against something that another neighbor said, but I think that it's the best thing for the house.
And I concur, and this is not personal. It's, we're here to make the best decision that this board can make and to make it fairly. And so it's, the Beals have contributed greatly to the neighborhood, and all of you that live in an HP area, the rules are different. I mean, the standard for you as a homeowner is different than if you lived in Edmond or another
Absolutely.
neighborhood. And so I'm appreciative and recognize that. So thank you for your testimony.
And I would just like to say again in closing that I'm a layperson as far as ceramic tile on roofs go, but it looks like the same roof, except for it's a darker shade.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This time I'd like to invite Mr. Gaines to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, board members. My name is Patrick Gaines, 624 Northwest 15th, and I apologize, I'll be brief. I do not have prepared comments because, like Mr. Box said, I am a sitting commissioner with the HP Commission. I do not feel that it is appropriate for us as commissioners to come up and speak on an appeal like this, but I just wanted to say that Mr. Tague was talking. In his comments, he was saying, we as commissioners said X, Y, and Z. We as commissioners made this motion, we made that motion, and I did not concur with the commission at that time and with this CA, and I wanted to make that clear that that was not a unanimous decision, and that...
And if I recall, you had recused yourself, actually.
I did on the second one, yes, sir, but on the first one I did not.
And at the first meeting, that was the October meeting, and there was a preliminary discussion about this, and the application was continued.
Right, but I spoke out against. I spoke in favor of the roof that was being put on, and so although there was not a vote, and I recused myself on the second one, I just wanted to make it known that the board was not unanimous in their thoughts on the CA. Thank you.
Anybody else from the public that wishes to speak either in protest or in favor of this application? Marva? Yes, you may.
You all were faxed or emailed a letter from Historic Preservation, Inc., most likely, which is the Neighborhood Association for Heritage Hills. And Christy brought it up, and I think I met Christy and Kirk when they first moved into the neighborhood. And it's not pleasant for any of us to have to sit here and talk about differences of opinions that might lead to hard feelings. I do old buildings for a living, and 610 Northwest 14th is a person to me. It's not just the Beals home. I try to look at it as not who lives there now, but that house had a life before and will have a life going forward. Heritage Hills was founded because of the preservation ordinance. Buildings, homes were being torn down on 13th Street. The neighborhoods were threatened. Oklahoma City, Mayor Shirk at the time, asked the neighborhoods to organize. The city wrote the first preservation ordinance. That has been what we have lived by. Without it, we would have died. The board has asked you all to uphold the vote of the HP Commission. It's not an easy thing to get a board of neighbors to sit and look and say, we don't want to offend the Beals, we don't want to divide the neighborhood, but this is what makes Heritage Hills and other preservation districts viable. There was another option. When Ms. Montgomery wrote her staff report, she had not seen the field report from Ludowici saying that there were other tiles available that would match much more closely in color and be cost affordable in this situation, which is not a common situation for any of us. And I would ask that you think of the welfare of that house going forward and what it contributes to the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members.
Excuse me, Dennis, just a moment. Do we have another request to speak?
Yes, I didn't know I needed to sign up or anything.
Dennis, do you mind if we allow her to an opportunity to speak very quickly. Please, your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Barbara Brockhouse, and my address is 230 Northwest 17th Street. I'm also a neighbor, a resident of Heritage Hills. And I'll tell you, I try to watch the commission meetings. And the reason why that I try to watch them is two things. I like being informed of what's going on, not only in Heritage Hills and Mesta Park, the two closest ones to me, but in all of the historic district, because without these guidelines, I would hate to see what would have happened to some of these houses. So I'm glad that we have them. On the other hand, I cannot tell you how many times I've had to, thankfully, have my DVR, pause it, take a little walk around, and then come back and sit back down and continue watching. And it's because, as a neighbor, as a homeowner, I need the guidelines to be followed as they're written. When decisions are made that are based on the personal taste and style of the individual commissioners, I have no assurance of what I might be able to do with or to my own house. I don't have a tile roof. I have a composition roof. This is not an issue that will ever come up to me. But what I've heard just here today is that we're looking at appearance, style, composition, and color. And yet it's been stated that style might be being determined more as the manufacturer as opposed to what I think of as style. I'm hearing that there's been times that we've voted in favor of the composition of one thing even though the appearance and the style was different. There was mentioned by the commissioner earlier that range of colors have been approved and would be approved. I believe, if I was hearing correctly, that the Ludovici tile that's being discussed as an alternative, and I don't know if we have that tile. Do we have a tile? The alternative one that the color would still be different, maybe closer, but still be different, but that it would be a different shape. I'm not an expert. I can't tell you which one of those might be the most important. But I can tell you this, as a homeowner, it's extremely frustrating to feel like the decisions that are made about these homes are not always following the guidelines. Listening to the motion that was made and that was voted upon, there seemed to be a lot of opinion in there and not a lot of, well, I'm going back to this guideline and this is why I'm voting down on this. So thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate your service. I appreciate the service of the commissioners. They do a really, really hard job, and I do admire them for attempting to get it right. And I would say most of the time they do get it right. They do a very, very nice job. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Box.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Dennis Box, and I appreciate you letting me have the last word to kind of discuss an overview of some of what you've heard. As you said, Mr. Chairman, at the very first, this is about looking at the guidelines that you all are to follow. Look at what HP did. Mr. Stonecipher did a very good job of analyzing and asking questions of Mr. Tague in regard to the sections of the code, and I think it's very important for you to recognize that as David Box went through all of the findings of fact, and this was not something that the staff put together saying, well, if you approve it, this is what we think. They analyzed it, looked at it, made a determination. In their opinion, it met the guidelines, and in their opinion, they thought it should be approved. We agree with them. It's not that often I agree with them, but in this case, we agree with them. And I think it's important that we recognize that the Oklahoma City Code 59-425.4 D7 adopted the exact conditions and specific findings of fact that we analyzed for not only the HP but for this board to review. So when you look at it, whether you look at it under 2.7, whether you look at it under the standards that we went through. I submit to you, if you will look at the two pictures that are shown on this exhibit, that we meet the intent of the code provisions. One of those is the assessor's picture. One of them is with the new tile on. And so I have been involved in several appeals, one with the former mayor, one with an individual that ended up spending about $500,000 on windows. This does get personal, but it gets personal because when somebody is trying to do everything right and they still are told that they don't have an opportunity to, as you can see by this exhibit, put on a tile roof that they spent $125,000 for to try to come into compliance, it makes it difficult to understand why they got a no vote. But that's why you all are here. You all have heard the facts. Now, I will submit to you that what we have presented in our booklets outlines a number of facts, not what people heard, not what discussions were with some tile company, but actual facts in regard to this case. And on this case, there's no question, if you go to Exhibit F, that what was put on in 1908 is not available. There's no question that under the standards, we have complied with a roof that looks very similar to what was there before. We'd ask your approval. We'll respond to any questions if you have any.
I have a few comments before, if you'd like, be seated, and I've got a few comments that I would like the board to hear before, as we consider this matter. Could somebody bring me the samples of the tiles and just lay them up here for us to look at again? When it comes to the cost of the roof, this was an insurance claim, and so I'm assuming that the homeowners were fully reimbursed minus their deductible for the cost of the roof.
What does that matter? Would be the question.
Are you citing the cost of the roof?
Well, but the standards say you can look at the cost of the roof in comparison with the value of the home. That's one of the conditions that the federal guidelines should allow you to look at. Whether insurance paid for it or not, it would make no sense to do a custom run to get a little bit closer in color and spend over 60% on a roof in comparison with the value of the house.
But the matter before us is conformance with the guideline.
Mm-hmm. And that's a factor to look at. Economics.
The tiles we have before us, the one in the center is what was original to the house. This tile, Sam, is the tile that you sourced in Dallas when you worked on the house. And in your testimony, you stated that you looked...
Quarter of that roof was that tile.
That you looked. And I think when we look at the Ludovici rep's letter, he talks about, in an ideal scenario when there's roof damage and repairs are needed, that the ideal situation is to save, the part of the roof that is salvageable, to seek a replacement, which is in conformance with the guideline, of like material, of the same size, same shape, as close as you can get, and that if there's not an exact match, then, the location of the new and the old tiles and how they are mixed to create an overall appearance on the roof is the preferred way. And I think when I heard your testimony, that's what you did. Am I correct?
You couldn't mix those two tiles. You can't mix them.
Because of the different...
Right, because they lay on the roof differently. Those In fact, that one is extruded. It's continuously run, chop, chop. It's a machine-made tile. The other one is hand-cast.
But in terms of the location of these two tiles on the roof, the previous...
I had a porch roof that I could replace entirely with that smaller tile, and then a plane of the roof on the back that I could also replace with that less expensive tile. The original tile then was removed and brought around front, so a quarter of the roof was a different tile altogether.
Mark, you had a comment?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'm concerned on, we're reviewing this based upon, in part, a record that came from the commissioners on the January 4th. We do not have a sample of that other tile. It's not before this. We do?
We have it. It's in a box down there someplace. We did bring that.
Is it made a part of the record January 4th?
It is part of the record brought forward. This is the tile that was there.
While we're doing that too, Mr. Jones had asked a question about, the extent of the loss, and it was represented by the insurance company as 100% loss. And just for clarity, I think that means, that in the insurance eyes, in terms of a claim, it represented 100% loss. It doesn't necessarily represent a loss of 100% of the roof material.
Right. I believe, Mr. Chairman, my question was what remaining portion would have been deemed salvageable, if any?
I'm sorry, I never saw the roof. The photographs are the only information I would have.
And I think that's what's difficult in this. I feel like if we had a time machine and a field trip, we'd be able to go back and see, actually, because even with the photos that I look at here, a lot of this, the colors, I don't know if those photos were taken at the same time and the position of the sun. There are a lot of factors to take into consideration, and that's one of the difficulties here for me. But
Mark, did you have any additional comments, or did...
I guess the one thing that I would note is, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to move to, and Roland Tague is an excellent lawyer and made a great presentation here today, and I consider him a friend. But I'm going to move to reverse the Commission's denial of HPCA 11-00132, and I'm going to do that based upon the evidence that was presented at the Commission's January 4th meeting, including the specific findings of fact of the staff report, and also based upon the arguments that were made here today.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Register your vote. You are approved. Would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Register your vote. And we are adjourned.